Good morning. So, how was that dinner last night? So we want to thank the Free Law Society, Free Law folks for sponsoring that. Thank you very much. And afterwards, I went up to Vern and the Originals. I said, Vern, one of us grabbed our iPhone and took a little video and put it up on YouTube. And Vern went, what? Vern's about 80 years old, but then I said, you guys were great. And he was like, oh, thank you. So this is being recorded. What I would like to do is record a thank you to Vern. So I want you all to give him a rousing round of applause. Vern and the Originals. Thanks, Vern. All right, so got some housekeeping things to take care of. The Drupal lunch, Drupal for Law School's lunch will be in room 367, not in 433B. Room change. I forgot to ask this question yesterday. How many of you this is your first conference? First conference ever. Keep your hands up. Anybody sitting next to them, say hi to them. Great. Hi. All right, you've officially been welcomed to the conference. And speaking of official welcome, so did any of you who got an Angry Bird manage to hang on to it? Put your hand up. All right, so there they are. What's your name? Stephanie? So whoever's got Stephanie's name, you know where she is, okay? I'm looking for Katie Miller. Katie Miller here? Oh, there's Katie Miller. And what's your book recommendation? Louder, louder. I still didn't hear it, I'm sorry. The Corner by David Simon, all right. I'll write that down. Ah. And what's the name on your card? Jennifer from St. Thomas, probably Jennifer Martin. Oh, good. So, Jennifer, what's your book recommendation? And do you have an Angry Bird by any chance? Oh, maybe I can claim her Angry Bird now. No, I won't do that to you. All right. So, have you guys been playing the game? Yeah. Some? Yeah? Good. Yeah. Where's the iPad, right? Yeah. All right. So I've been getting questions about the other social game that we didn't talk about, the mystery social game. Right? Right? I'll give you a hint. You need 6 of these. 6 different ones. And that's all I'm going to say. All right, the luggage. You can bring your luggage tomorrow if you're checking out and put it into room 155, where we'll carefully go through it looking for Angry Birds. No, just kidding. And that's it for housekeeping. Any questions at this point? I want to give a shout out to all those great people in the overflow room. You guys are great up there. They're up on the second floor. Any questions, problems, issues, suggestions, ideas, complaints? Good. Oh, well, you have one, yes. More coffee. I can't disagree with that. All right, we'll make a note of that. Well, now I would like to announce, or like to introduce our plenary speaker. I'm not going to talk about how he got here today. I'm sure he will. And I'm not going to give him an introduction because I think that should be a mystery. But for our listening pleasure, Richard Nash.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much. Yeah, I was supposed to be able to hear some of Vern last night, but instead I was on the Amtrak from New York to Boston because my flight from New York to Milwaukee was canceled at 5:30 yesterday. So, but what I figured out to do was get on a train to Boston, spend 5 hours in a hotel in Boston, and then get the 6:30 flight this morning from Boston to Milwaukee. I then, just to sort of like add a little, I then went. I still would have preferred to have heard Verne, but thank you for that applause. So, I mean, the very fact of I was a little intimidated when John invited me to speak here. I was sort of intimidated because my wife is a lawyer, I get made fun of for being an amateur. That's my wife there. For being an amateur copyright lawyer working in the publishing business. And so I told her I was going to be speaking to an audience of lawyers and law librarians and the people who love them. And and she looked at me as if I was crazy, and what were they thinking, inviting that ne'er-do-well husband of mine to come speak to them. And but over a period of time, she warmed to the idea of what I was going to be doing, and started feeding me some suggestions, a reading list. A lot of stuff around copyright law, yes, but also around the First Amendment, and around the affirmative notion that to exercise your First Amendment rights, you don't just need freedom from censorship. It's not just negative liberty that produces an informed citizenry, but it is an affirmative right. It is the right to be presented with different viewpoints, contentious viewpoints, to be part of a robust debate around how society is to be organized. And I realized as I was sort of going through that kind of dovetailed quite beautifully with a lot of my more mundane shtick around the future of publishing and the democratization of consumption of knowledge and also the production of knowledge. And it kind of, after a while, I started a little bit to get the shivers about how thrilling it was to realize that there was a larger social good being created by the transformations in publishing and the generation and dissemination of book learning in our society. That it wasn't just good for readers, it was good for everybody. And to sort of try to explain a little bit how I got to all this, I'm going to do what I tend to do, which is go back in history. I actually used to be a theater director before I worked in publishing, and I directed the plays of William Butler Yeats, who was a playwright in addition to an underrated playwright, in addition to being a reasonably well-rated poet. One of the this is one of his classics, one of his classic quotes. And what it represented to me is what I think of as what we could call writing 1.0. And that is that before printing, a writer was basically a reproduction machine. A writer didn't have original ideas, quote unquote, and that didn't matter because originality wasn't the point. The words were there. They were in the air. They were gods or the gods. They belonged to everybody, to the tribe, to the community, to the society. And one could not effectively separate the speaker at the campfire in the forum one could not separate his or her, typically his, unfortunately at the time, words from the words that belonged to everybody. It was an act of cultural expression. The speaker was the shaman, a channel, a conduit through which things flowed, but not the inventor. And I'm gonna. I didn't plan on having so many philosophers quoted on my slides, but it just sort of started developing that way, and I ran with it. This is how Barth characterizes a particular time in human evolution prior to printing. So obviously, with the advent of printing, the position of the writer changed. One of the advantages of being a writer before printing is that you were guaranteed a living. It was the one time when mom and dad didn't say, "You're going to be a writer." There's no money in writing, because there was money in writing. There was money in reading and in writing because you were one of the few people who could. It was a very rare skill. And then as printing came along, the role of the writer as mechanic, as Xerox machine, vanished. So what was a writer to do at that particular point? Well, I'll get on in a second to what the writer was going to do, but let's first think about what the printers started to do, because over a period of time, the technology, the cost of these machines got higher and higher as they scaled, as it became sort of more industrial scale. It's required capital. Printing books required capital. And the printer in the next city over also had access to capital. And how was he going to spend his capital? Well, the trick was to spend the capital on the thing that was selling the best, whether or not it was an author that printer typically printed. So this was, great for the consumers, but it was terrible for the printers. Bad margins when everybody is pirating your stuff. So effectively, they formed a cartel in the UK, specifically, in the late 1600s, and they effectively agreed to stop knocking off one another's stuff so that they could all make more money. And then in 1709, Parliament decided, and the UK decided, if anyone's going to run a cartel around here, it's going to be us. Cartels are all well and good. We think they're fantastic, but we're running the cartel. And thus begins copyright. Now, the thing is, that only works when you've got a parliament with teeth, when you've got a nation. What of the poor Germans? The Germans hadn't a parliament. The Germans hadn't a Germany. They had 300 different little city-states and principalities and archduchies and miscellaneous feudal domains. So in that particular case, they couldn't. There was nobody on top to sort of decide who was going to run the political cartel. So every city's printers were encouraged to pirate the hell out of the other city's printers, because we're not paying money so that the hamburgers are going to get some Frankfurter money. So the writers at this particular situation. So the dancer has now been separated from the dance, right? But the damn printers own the dance, or they control the dance. It's nominally in the name of the author, but as you all know, power tends to rest in the people who have the capital rather than the the ability simply to license something. So the writers start trying to debate, well, what are we going to do about this copyright situation in Germany? And you've got sort of two distinct points of view, as one often gets when you have arguments about copyright in present-day Western society. So you've got one German fellow pointing out that there's always been a great many things one could do with a book. Why on earth is the one thing I can't do with a book the ability just to make a copy of it? Now, nowadays we can answer that particular question, but I throw up this point of view to sort of suggest that this is something that has evolved and is of relatively recent vintage. And I particularly encourage you to look at that last phrase, a published book is a secret divulged, because that's something I want to talk about a little bit later. The flip side, of course, is that there was obviously another point of view. And the interesting thing here, though, is that what the Germans did, which the Brits had failed to do, was they came up with intellectual justification for copyright, a moral justification for copyright, as opposed to an economic or utilitarian justification. Effectively, the Germans invented genius. The word genius, nowadays we associate it with individuals, but in its origin, genius refers to a place, the spirit of a place or of a people. The unique animating spirit or force or anima of a people or a place. You still see that usage here and there in language. But what the Germans started to do is they found a way to reside it in the human. Now, partially that had to do with the Enlightenment and trying to sort of like get God out of everybody's business. But part of it also had to do with coming up with a intellectual justification for ownership of the words and the sequence of words that was being produced. The interesting thing is that over the 19th century, as the sort of the debate, two quotes of which I have up there, proceeded, was that Germany produced so many books. The German publishing output, depending on how you calculate it, was 4 to 5 times greater than in the UK, which had copyright. So perversely enough, we discover, at least in this one particular instance, that the lively arts didn't need copyright to be lively. They were very lively without it, even if some of the liveliness had to do about complaining that it wasn't yet in existence. And now we come back to Barth again. Well, I'm kind of repeating myself there, so we'll skip past that. So if we've got obviously the Germans eventually instigated copyright. Barth never gave them really credit for that. But so if we've got writing 1.0 beginning, ending effectively with Gutenberg, and we have the invention of copyright and its grounding in the intellectual fabric of Western society. What's the next phase? The next phase, I would argue, is July of 1985. The little graphic that I threw up to represent the beginning of publishing, the beginning of writing 2.0, that wasn't Gutenberg. It was Aldus, who was a Venetian printer. One of the things I like about Aldus is he didn't go bankrupt. So for publishers, he's a kind of a better model to follow than Gutenberg. Aldous also invented italics and the semicolon and the paperback. So he's you know he's a nice little figure to look up on Wikipedia when you have a sec. And the other thing is that in 1985, these people release a software called Pagemaker, and they name their company after him. And the significance of that moment, I think, is dramatically underplayed in a lot of the conversation that goes around the transformations that technology has wrought upon publishing and books in the present time. Especially if you put it in concert with Kinko's. Because what Pagemaker does is it allows the average Joe on the street to make a PDF. Up until that point, even if you had the money to print a book, if you had 10 grand to give to a printer, it was still kind of impossible to have a conversation with the printer. It would be like trying to go up to some construction company and say, here's a picture of a bridge. Go build it. Construction companies need mechanical drawings. They need civil engineers. There is a system that allows a person who imagines something to convert it into a large-scale mechanical artifact. And that was also true of printing. You couldn't just hand your manuscripts to a printer. They wouldn't know what to do with you. Everybody at a printer was the entire company was organized around talking to manufacturing directors and to production managers. And along comes Pagemaker, and it allows anyone to create a PDF that could be handed on a file to a printer. And then along comes Kinko's, and it gives you access to that for $6 an hour. And in the early 1990s, you have indie record labels designing their CDs, the cover art of their CDs in Kinko's. You have poets and those indie bands designing the flyers. You have magazines and zines, and indeed book publishers. And the book publisher that I used to run, Soft Skull Press, began in a Kinko's and the Graveyard Shift in 1993, when my predecessor, a 21-year-old third-year creative writing student at Eugene Lang College, which is the undergraduate college at the New School University, realized that no one was going to publish it for him, so him and his girlfriend on the Graveyard Shift laid it out 4 to an 8.5 by 11 page, printed it out, and over the course of 4 weeks, printed them out over and over and over again from midnight to 8 a.m. when there was no manager in the store. Chop, chop, tape bind 400 books in 4 weeks. And that particular press, by 2009, has a Pulitzer finalist, has a Singapore Straits Times bestseller, has 2 books reviewed on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. Now, a lot of that is old media or establishment affirmation that maybe we don't necessarily need anymore. But at the time Soft Skull begins in 1993, that stuff was the apotheosis of what you could accomplish. And it became available over a period of time to a third-year undergraduate. And that's because of Aldous Pagemaker, not because of the web. And that's not to take anything away from the web, but just to point out that there is a continuum here. There is a continuum of technology that much as we speak of technology as disruptive, and in many ways it is, book publishing has always been a disruptive technology. It was disruptive when Gutenberg and Aldous used it. It was disruptive when the retailers in the 19th century, the book retailers were the first people to take the product and put it on shelves for browsers to touch. All retail involved going up to a counter, asking for what you wanted, and then they went back to the storeroom and brought it out to you. Book retailers were the first people to put the books on shelves and allow the customer to touch and inspect and browse the product before they bought it. So I'm going to, when I was chatting earlier with John, we were talking about William Gibson. And I'm generally eschewing, in my, as you notice, it's all philosophers. But one could call William Gibson a philosopher after a fashion. But this is the only sort of like contemporary internet believer who I'm going to quote over the course of this entire presentation. In part because this particular quote, which I actually don't know what of Gibson's it comes from, I found it in a wonderful book by a nonfiction writer named David Shields called Reality Hunger. And in many respects, I think what's more interesting is not the sort of last two polemical bits, the last two polemical sentences, but the stuff that comes before it, because that's sort of going to lead me into the sort of next part of the conversation, which is that if we've got this kind of trajectory of technology disrupting on an ongoing basis, but effectively increasing access, what is there a point at which you don't go any farther? And I think effectively we've reached that point. Supply of knowledge is now effectively infinite. There is more knowledge created in our society now than any one of us is ever going to be able to consume in our lifetimes. And that's probably been true now for maybe 20 or 30 years, maybe even 50 years. So the challenge now is how do we deal with the demand side? And the nub of it, the sort of pivot point, I would argue, is best exemplified by Netflix. This quote behind me came from an article in this one was in Wired magazine about the Netflix prize, the $1 million prize that Netflix offered the world's mathematicians to improve their rating prediction algorithm by 10%. For about 18 months, this was one of the hottest topics in the world of applied mathematics, was how do we make the algorithm that says if so-and-so gave 4 out of 5 stars to Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line, and I've given 4 out of 5 stars to that, what other movies am I likely to like based on that? Because the problem that Netflix had is that its early customers, they were all picking the movies that they'd always meant to see, right? I mean, that's what I did when I first went on to Netflix. You have in your head 50 or 75 or 100 films that you always meant to see, never got around to seeing them. All of a sudden, here comes Netflix. You can, list them all, and over a period of a couple of years, you'll get them all. But eventually, you run out, right? Eventually, you've seen all the movies that you had always meant to see. So why are you going to keep paying them $15 a month? They had to figure out a way to get you to watch movies you didn't yet know you wanted to see. And that's effectively what this sort of like next universe of the sort of the challenge of dealing with the dissemination of knowledge is how do you get people to know what they need to know or consume the media that you want them to consume. And it's sometimes some people challenge me on this sort of the oversimplification of supply and demand, and I say, well, okay, fair enough. It's not about demand, but it's about matchmaking. It's about how do we put the right material together with the right person, and I would argue that I sort of titled my speech when I hear the word content, I reach for my revolver. I titled that. It's partially the title, but it's not really the title. It was a sort of a little provocation that was a dummy provocation. Right? Because a lot of people coming out of traditional publishing, education, and so on and so forth, hate the use of the word content when you're talking about books. And I get why that's kind of ugly. But part of the reason I had that up there was because there's two reasons. But one is that it was a little joke in relation to something that is in fact a classic misquotation. It's also a misapplied misquotation. No one ever said that. What in fact they said in German was, when I hear culture, I reach for my Browning. And it wasn't Goering who said it, and it wasn't Goebbels who said it. It was out of a play in the early 1930s. And that is a sort of an example, though, of the ways in which it is not a simple process of taking a set of agreed upon facts and just feeding them to the world. It's a much messier, uglier, but ultimately fruitful process by which culture gets made. It is a really useful phrase to us socially to have that term. When I hear the word culture, I reach for my revolver. It's a brilliant way of explaining to people certain aspects of fascist culture or of Nazi culture. The ability of culture to offend is a powerful thing, and that quote is a superb way of illustrating that in a phrase. And the fact that it is factually wrong and continually misattributed is not the point. From a pedagogical standpoint, from a standpoint of how do we move the culture along. And what I would argue is that what that illustrates is that culture ultimately is more powerful than content. Because if we go back now a little bit, back into the past again, and look to a particular moment in the evolution of printing, the moment when the steam engine gets attached to the printing machine, and that it's not just human power that's moving things along, but industrial power. That is an interesting moment, because at that moment, printing and culture gets hitched to the economies of scale of the Industrial Revolution. Now, Marx does not, well, Marx gets trotted out in many ways all the time, obviously, but one area in which I've noticed Marx doesn't get trotted out has to do with the evolution of culture and the evolution of culture in relation to technologies of dissemination. One of the things that became clear to me recently is that all the stuff that Marx talked about in terms of alienation, the worker being alienated from his or her product, was beautifully true in the case of the writer and the book and the reader. Because we're talking about a situation where once it was a person gathered with other people around the campfire, and then it is transformed into this elaborate industrial process of writer, subsequently agent, editor, publisher, printer, wholesaler, distributor, retailer, reader. Why did that happen? It happened because that's the classic need of industrial production. That in an ideal world for a publisher, there is one book and 300 million people read it. And that's where you get the lowest unit costs of all, right? And everything else is sort of just not quite as good as that kind of perfect situation, so long as you're that publisher. So the chasing of economies of scale is just one of the sort of fundamental aspects of industrial revolution production. And yes, it produces all kinds of broad social effects that Marx analyzed quite beautifully, even if his solutions weren't always necessarily the most productive. But it was, I feel, sort of exceptionally true of the writer and his or her relationship to the reader. Because what was once something that was intimately connected is now something that was sort of ripped asunder. And what also gets lost then in those particular situations is not just the connection between the writer and the reader, but the connections between reader and reader, and the connections between writer and reader. And you have then this situation where we're kind of, in this industrial revolution situation, we're kind of like Adam and Eve. We've been cast out of Eden. And I believe that what the web has done is given us a chance to be restored to a prelapsarian state. And I know that that's quite grand, a statement. But, you know, I recently, 10 minutes ago, poo-pooed the significance of the web in relation to the production of culture. So I'd now like to be nice to the web and say, but where its real importance comes is not that it allows more things to be created, although it does incrementally, but that it allows for a much, much, much more interesting relationship to that which is being created, to all this content that is being created. How do we engage with it all? And in a certain sense, Barth, maybe about 20 or 30 years, 30 or 40 years ago at this stage, sort of said, well, that's what we do is we kill the author. He means that metaphorically, but what he's talking about is you know, with all the post-structuralists who wanted to sort of rip apart the text in English departments and Romance language departments across the Western academic sphere. What you know, to some degree they were just trying to get tenure, but you know, deep down there was a very interesting impulse, and that impulse was to restore the reader and to restore a sense of that readers were needed to complete the book. Because, I mean, we've always known that, right? That the power of the text-only book is that you can't smell it, you can't see any of the things in it, you can't hear, you can't see the leaves, you can't smell the... I'm going to say that you can't smell the fart, and I'm going to say fart because the first modern novel I ever read at the age of 15 was Peter Carey's Illywhacker, and the protagonist uses the word fart in the first paragraph, and it absolutely blew my mind. I had no idea that things like novels had words like fart in them. So I couldn't help myself that one time. Okay, so so it is the web and I use that in a lowercase sense, it is the web of connectivity between people that I think becomes the critical issue. And I think, in a certain sense, no one has exemplified that better than Oprah. Oprah is sort of frequently represented, especially in trade publishing, as the savior of trade publishing, right? Because she gets people to sort of magically buy 4 million books. And I remember realizing at one point, well, wait a minute. We keep acting as if Oprah is the savior of books, but perhaps we could make a case for books being the savior of Oprah. Because she had a TV show. She had a 1-hour daytime TV show along with a bunch of other daytime TV talk show hosts. Unidirectional. Her ratings weren't even that spectacular at the time. I mean, they were decent for daytime television, but it wasn't like anything like the effect Oprah has nowadays. And how was she to overcome the real flaw of television, the fact that it is unidirectional, and the fact that you get your 1 hour of talking to someone, and then you get half hour of something else, of soap, and then you get a half hour of sports, and then you get news, such as it is, and so on and so forth. So she's only got you 1 hour of the day. How does she get you the other 23 hours? How does she build mind share? Through her book club. Through an object that takes 15 hours of the inside of your head. An object that takes 15 hours of the inside of your head and then compels you to tell your friends about it. How do you get into people's bathrooms, their bedrooms, their around the lunch table with their friends? You do it through books. And you do it by listening as much as telling. You do it by sharing. You do it through humility. You do it collectively. You do it socially. These are a lot of words that get used talking about the web a lot, but they have, in fact, nothing to do with the web because Oprah's activity really predated any level of significant web-based book conversation. So you have a situation then where the very weakness that books are seen as having in our society, the fact that they take so damn long to read, the fact that they are so demanding and don't have, many of them don't have that many pretty pictures, the fact that you can't do anything else at the same time. You can't iron while reading. You can't cook the dinner while reading. You can't drive the car while reading, except unless you have an audiobook. So the very challenge of it actually are their greatest asset, because it's how you start to own minds. And that is the kind of foundation, I think, on which we can build tools that are driven by what humans actually need and what humans want, rather than on the Industrial Revolution. So you get, the other part of my joke in that title is that, in a certain sense, part of what I reach for my revolver when I hear the word content is not because I don't love books, but it's because I'm much more interested in what books do to connect people than I am in them as fixed objects, as frozen artifacts. Now, I love a frozen artifact as much as the next guy, and I was never a choose-your-own-adventure person, and I don't particularly fetishize or am particularly interested in, to my eternal shame, hypertext. It's one of the sort of, I'm seen as a guy who likes to talk about the future of publishing, and then these people discover that, oh, Richard doesn't read hypertext novels, Richard isn't looking for multimedia novels, and it's sort of embarrassing that most of what I'm interested in is fairly fixed text. But I don't think that fixed text has to be any less interactive, any less social, any less a part of culture than its more linked incarnations. Because I think what becomes critical is to get to the point where we don't see the hyperlinks, where we don't see the embedded video, even though it's there. Because what the book has shown us so powerfully is that technology, when it works, is invisible. Because the book is technology, right? The book has always been technology. But there's a way that you can walk into a room that's covered in books and you don't see them. But you walk into a room with 3 laptops and you immediately pick out where the laptops are. We don't see chairs anymore, even though chairs are technology. We don't see haircuts to some degree mostly anymore, even though haircuts require technology too. It's the immature technology. That's what we end up seeing. And what we have to sort of focus on from a standpoint of the application of technology then is, where does technology allow the writer and reader to become one? Where does it allow the reader to write back, to annotate, to take notes, to imitate, to copy, to share with peers, irrespective, perhaps, of the form in which it is presently? How do we allow readers the same powers that writers have? And we've gotten closer and closer to that state. This thingy right here that John gave you guys, this USB with the EPUBs of case law, is a tool which, on the one hand, you could download a PDF, or if they put, maybe all these cases are up online in nice little HTML and you could just forward links to. But in an interesting way, by making them a little bit more book-like, it can potentially encourage the kind of sharing that we know to do with books, the kind of annotation and marginal creation that we know how to books, to write back in more interesting ways by connecting to our understanding of technology, connecting technology to our habitus, to how we know how to interact with things. One of the reasons why I didn't want to quote too many internet geniuses, I particularly, I gave you William Gibson, but I could equally sort of say that I would have nothing to say if it weren't for the brilliance of Clay Shirky and his writing about collective action on the internet. But part of the reason I didn't want to was because I wanted to look at writers who have engaged with society, engaged with the creation of culture, engaged with the dissemination of knowledge, engaged in writing novels, engaged with writing nonfiction, engaged with disseminating information that had nothing to do with the internet, to illustrate how everything that they have to say about the world can be better accomplished now that we have the internet to connect writers and readers and readers and readers and writers and writers. And I'll take questions if I still have time.
Absolutely. It always takes a few minutes for people to exhale. Could fill the time by saying, if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll come to you with a microphone so that it can be captured forever on the internet. There we go. State your name first.
John DePrisco. In the old days with books, there was a hierarchy where maybe the publishers or the editors or whatever could screen or even kill thought. And now with, say, blogs or whatever, you're starting to see a certain flattening of that power. But is there a negative to that where we're being inundated with banality, basically? Yeah. There's no real way to score things.
Yeah. The thing that I look to is a world where there are hundreds of thousands of mini Oprahs performing that role. My vision of it, and I know, to return to a prelapsarian world obviously is kind of impossible, and so there was a certain ironic, certain jokiness that I wanted to get across when saying that. One of the things that I do love about what Clay Shirky has to say is that the internet just doesn't make everything automatically better. No technology has ever made anything automatically better. Technology is tools, and it can be used for good or for ill. And so every technological transformation has broadened our ability to create crap. We can now make more crap than we've ever been able to make before. We're able to say more crap, hear more crap, produce more crap than we've ever been able to before. We've also been able to create more interesting stuff than we've ever been able to before. So the challenge, and I think in a certain sense, the people I tend to talk to tend to be publishers, writers, probably less frequently librarians. But what I'm basically imagining is whether you call them publisher, whether you call them librarian, whether you call them retailer, whether you call them influencer, there needs to be this tremendously sophisticated network of influencers and intermediaries who are helping sift and sort and advise and coax and cajole. And I think of it as a matchmaking activity to try to de-hierarchicalize it. That's a terrible, terrible neologism there, I know. But hierarchies typically have failed. And the only reason we don't look to see how badly they've failed is that they tend to define the terms in which they're viewed. So as I point out, everybody's like, what about the golden era of publishing when we were publishing Updike and Mailer and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, the golden era of a bunch of white men in tweed jackets publishing each other. The only reason we don't know that there wasn't a vast amount of brilliant stuff they didn't publish was because they didn't publish it. But we can certainly look at the whiteness and maleness and waspiness of everything to be fairly confident that there were a whole bunch of non-white, non-male people writing incredible stuff that was being ignored. You know, just look at Mad Men. I mean, publishing was worse than Mad Men. So the trick for us then is sort of, okay, so we have to kind of give up on the hierarchies. We have to give up on using bottlenecks as a way of sifting through the crap. And instead, effectively, what we're talking about is creating networks of people who are working really hard, sometimes not paid very well, sometimes not paid at all. But that's where the value is. In a certain sense, I believe that, you know, my carping about copyright is intended to kind of suggest that copyright is not where the value is going to be. And certainly if you tell an economist that the supply of X has become infinite, he or she is immediately going to tell you, well, then the price of it is going to be zero. So if the price of content is zero, if content is ubiquitous, where does value reside? I think value resides in helping people find the right content.
Okay. I have a question.
Yeah.
So I understand about the value of getting writers and readers closer together. I'm going to ask you to apply that to education. The web is held out in a promise that it brings the teachers and the learners together, or it takes the teacher out of it and makes the learner closer to the subject material, which in the past would have been the textbook,
right,
and therefore the writer and the reader again. But even the textbook is an interposition between the data or the content and the learner. How is this all going to happen?
I mean, the textbook, honestly, and I should be more diffident here, but I'm not going to be diffident. I'm going to be provocative, and I will be happily shot down on this. But the textbook kind of feels like there's no point to it. The textbook is sort of like an asynchronous tool